Because we're talking about culture change, and as you listen around the themes at the tables and everyone's navigating their own objective statements and what they're trying to get after, there's commonality in recognizing that the influencers in any organization, we have to address both organizational change, which starts with the individuals. Because if we don't establish the level of buy-in and alignment with the individual, then we're going to struggle, right? And sometimes that's the CEO, sometimes that's the operational leader, whomever it may be. So I want to start this conversation and leverage the thoughtfulness and experiences of our panel to draw on your own personal experiences as it relates to driving culture change. But let's talk about the individuals, right? Those people with whom we have to sit in front of and appeal to this vision around culture change. How do you navigate the individual change that's required, meaning the behavioral change, the mindset change with the key stakeholders or influencers that will shape the strategic direction for the business? Let's start there. Y'all can just pass the mic. Who wants to start?
I think one of the first things is about connection. Like, as humans, we crave connection. I think vulnerability is one way to get to connection. Empathy is one way to get to connection. Lived experience is another way to think about this. Is my experience growing up as a white kid in North Miami and coming out as gay at 15 in 1982 is different than Donte's or the Melissas or anybody's. And so I think it's really meeting people where they are and trying to understand. I'd love to get your perspective on this, but we are all who we are because of how we've grown up, the parents we had, the people and the environments that we grew up in and our influences, and our lived experiences and how we receive information. And so I think that's part of it, and you're right, it starts with individuals. I mean, culture is a group of individuals making up something bigger than themselves. And so how do we meet them where they are? How do we understand their maybe resistance to change and their desire to hang on to the old or what had got them there? And I always say what got us here isn't going to get us there. And so thinking through it through their eyes and trying to meet them kind of where they are, I think is one way I approach it.
Make this note: meeting them where they are. Meeting them where they are. Make sure y'all write that down because we're going to revisit that. Meeting them where they are.
Yeah. No, I really love what you're saying because, so I feel like there's like 3 phases of culture change that Brewpoint has had over these past 10 years. And how it works on a personal place for me. So before starting Brewpoint, I thought I was going to be like a missionary. It's funny because we have friends now who are just kind of like, you kind of are, but you just did it entirely differently. Like, you just did it through your business, through trying to make the world a better place, through having coffee shops that are inclusive and people feel cared about and they're finding belonging. And during that first phase of Brewpoint, I would call the first phase like I had all the right intentions, but no education or structure of knowing how to actually run a business that could create the resources and structures to fulfill those values. And so a lot of it was like I could sell the idea of the vision, I could like start the process of that vision, but we didn't have enough resources a lot of times to be able to follow through on the pay that we would want to pay or the way in which we'd want to like integrate farmers or the vendors we'd want to have. And then when the pandemic hit, the second phase I felt like what we went through was survival. And so we had the ability we had kind of grown pretty quickly as a company, and then we had to scale down a bit and just focus on survival. Essentially what we were able to do was talk to the team and essentially say, anyone who wants to stay during this, we're able to operate through a window. We only had to close one day, and we had like a certain amount of hours that we could divide between the whole team. And everyone divided and everyone divided hours based on everyone's needs. And so we didn't have to terminate anyone during that period of time. But for a couple of years, we were in survival mode. And we worked out of survival mode. We worked off of PPP money and all those different things. And then right now we're in the midst of a change of just like, okay, we can't operate in survival mode anymore. We don't have those additional grants or resources to just focus on that. We actually have to be profitable, sustainable. We have to grow. We have to be mindful of our resources. And so now we're shifting our entire culture into this. And I would say it's probably one of the more uncomfortable pieces for me, because I realize that as an entrepreneur and my own personal journey is that how I think about money, the fears I have around money, highly affect the structures of my company. And in order for me to do bigger things, different things, get from, I've gotten A to B to C, but if I'm going to get to F, like, I have to work through these things, but I feel terrified. My poem was about taking a leap, and it is like, yeah, it's scary to go through change, not just for the rest of your company, but for yourself as a leader. And it's just like, do I paint a brave face, or do I be vulnerable and authentic of like, I'm not exactly sure if this will work, but I'm going to do my very best. And if we do our best together, that's the only way we'll get through it.
Write this down. Understanding our own personal barriers and biases in the midst of the change process.
Yeah, and to bounce off of that, it's, it seems so simple on the surface of like, this starts with us, but it's so easy to forget and so easy to be stuck in the mindset of what got us here isn't going to get us there, but remembering that every day, being intentional when you've got a list that stretches 10 feet long of to-dos and somebody called out of a cafe and I've got 4 meetings today, taking the time that I've been trying over the last 6 months as we're doing this culture change to, at the start of my day, after lunch, just remind myself of like, I have to show up first. And if I don't keep that at the forefront of my mind, it's really easy to go into your regular routine and to go back into what got us here. But again, that's not going to get us there. And if I'm not focusing that, nobody else on my team is going to be thinking of that. Nobody else is going to be seeing that. It all starts with being intentional and doing that.
Write this down. I keep saying that because I want y'all to hear the themes that are coming from this. It's part of the culture change process. Maintaining a growth mindset. A growth mindset, which also means leaning into what we believe we need to maintain our course.
I'm going to add to that growth mindset, I'm going to add a learning orientation instead of a performance orientation, right? So we're going to, we're going to fail, we're going to try things out, we learn from failure, and it really goes, coincides with the growth mindset. But what I love about what everyone has been saying is the idea of, as leaders and as employees and as human beings, the importance of self-awareness is key to really, showing up in a way that's more productive, that's more collaborative, that's more open, that's less reactive, right? And it's, even with raised mindfulness, right? The idea of really connecting to who you are and being in touch with that and understanding that. What are my triggers? What pisses me off? And I say this from my own personal experience, having a pretty, a childhood with a lot of childhood trauma, right? And there's a lot of us, so I'm not like, oh, poor me. But there's an importance of really understanding that it's my responsibility to figure that out and understand how that's affecting who I am, how I'm showing up. And let me tell you something, I always thought it was everybody else being mean to me. The world is against me, right? And then suddenly, as I started doing the work, I realized, okay, wait, there's a dynamic here. And when we're leaders, or when we're leading an organization, or when we're entrepreneurs, or you said it so beautifully, Melissa, right? Like, my money things are showing up, and I'm aware of that. Those are the nuggets that then you can be like, okay, now I know what I have to work through and work with. And so that's why I'm always on the soapbox of like, get to know who you are, think about what you've experienced, what triggers you, right? And that kind of lets you know where you work, and then you can show up in beautiful ways for your organization, for your teams, and for yourself. So.
Awesome. So we're here with some themes. First is starting with showing up for ourselves with a level of intentionality and authenticity, because we're trying to bridge disconnects organizationally in terms of establishing and understanding We're trying to meet people where they are. We're trying to seek to understand for the sake of establishing buy-in for this vision that we have that we believe to be paramount to the organization's success. It starts with us, right? Because we have to practice what we preach. I was speaking to somebody, and I said, you know, one of the challenges we all have as practitioners is half the time we spend so much time advising and giving direction that we don't practice what we preach. In our own businesses and practices, or just in how we move with intentionality. So that's the individual work that we're all talking about. And oftentimes we become the counselor, the coach, the advisor to our executive leaders. Now let's talk about organizational change. So you have this individual work. My mic died, by the way, but I think y'all hear me okay, right? Organizational change is a difficult process, as we know. I want to unpack your organizational change journeys, but more specifically, can you share how do you establish the momentum required to realize the transformation in how a business operates, how leaders show up, how they engage, how they interact, how they make decisions that impact the business? What were those moments, catalytic moments in you driving your organizational change for your business directly or for your clients? Let's start with Melissa.
So in terms of Brewpoint's organizational change, one thing that I had been realizing as I was about to make the major change from survival out of the pandemic to a more growth mindset, was realizing that one of my deficits as a leader was that like I really wanted to be perceived as a good person, specifically for my team. And I had trouble, I had like feelings of like, okay, food and beverage, coffee specifically, if our average transaction value is like under $10, like, I mean, how much can my minimum wage be within my company without having to make some major structural changes, and feeling like I want to do more, but I don't know how this structure can actually do more. But regardless, it's my responsibility, regardless of the fact that there might be larger societal reasons why this is a struggle. And trying to figure out, and this is still a journey for me right now, of just like figuring out like, not to care so much about what like, not necessarily what, you know, what other people think, but more so like, what do I think? Like, am I doing the best I can? And am I communicating as thoughtfully as I can, as repetitively as I can, of like where we're at? Am I willing to be transparent? What are the things that I feel like I'm hiding? So it's so much of entrepreneurship is like a flattening out of like, I guess just like everything within you that like you can grow in. And so with that being said, going from this survival change to this growth change, about a year ago, we realized, okay, like we're gonna run out of PPP money. We're not gonna be able to keep sustaining the ways in which we've been able to run. And we have to make some shifts. And the big thing we have to look at first is our leadership team. How do we work and function? We are paid in a way that like we're meant to build the company, but all we're doing is supporting. All we're doing is taking shifts. All we're doing is like constantly running to make sure that everyone feels comfortable. And not that we don't want people to feel comfortable, but we can't build the company. We can't make more profit. We can't make more revenue. We're essentially becoming the most expensive baristas if we keep functioning this way. So at first there was a shift within the leadership team and coaching around like, how do we change? And then from there was with the management. Realizing that management was protecting a culture that wasn't allowing change. And so each cafe had its own process that was really, fast, a case study in and of itself. Some cafes, we, terminated the manager over a longer period of time. So we had to do it kind of right away once we discovered some things that were pretty like nasty underneath. And it was fascinating because, when I had read Angela's, top-down, bottom-up leadership, realizing that the fact that our culture change has taken 7 to 12 months, and we're finally coming out of it right now, and it's just like, wow, that I felt like we were dragging this. Like this was so long, but I think it was like kind of successful. And it was like really assuring to hear that like culture change just takes a long time. I didn't want to pull triggers right away because I wanted to make sure I knew what was going on before what was happening. I wanted to make thoughtful plans according to the data that we found out. And it just takes time. There's some pain points with that, but at this point, we're in a phase, we're having a great conversation with Laura around just like retention in the food and beverage industry, specifically coffee shops. It's like as much as we'd love retention for 2-3 years, when it's a minimum wage job, like how much retention do we, like is actually good for both parties, especially if they have student debt. And so we're now in a phase of being able to really grow the company.
Write this down. Understanding and being able to articulate your vision for the change that you're trying to drive, right? And being really succinct in what that expectation is. Because if you heard Melissa, it became the standard by which she measured who within her teams aligned or had the capacity to help her realize that vision. Without that foundation, then what am I measuring the efficacy of this leader against? So I got to be really clear about what that standard is and why it matters.
And for, in thinking through kind of these 3 periods that Melissa talked about, and at the start of today was really thinking about what I often thought of as like the golden period for Brewpoint's culture. And at that time, there were 7 of us. And it was really easy as someone who operates a lot with servant leadership to build that culture, to be there with the team. But as we've grown, now managing 3 teams of 10 to 15 people, plus a roastery team, and building up those managers to carry through and knowing that at a certain size and scale, servant leadership being there in my position is at a point detrimental to the teams. Me being available to jump in, cover a shift is helpful in that day, but it's preventing me from doing more higher level work that in the long run is going to benefit all of us a lot more. And so we're coming out of this phase of shifting from I'm always the person that you can call, I'll always be there, and moving into building confidence really in our managers and leaders who I work directly with of I've put you in this position because I know you can do this. I trust you. I need you to be confident and to be there for your team to get that feedback, because as we've grown, really learning the hard way of like, we can't do it all. We can't be in every location every day, and having those systems in place, having those people in place and guiding that through. And I believe can't remember exactly. I think it was an early conversation with Angela of, for at least for us, like documentation leads these culture changes. Having things documented, having operations really clear, really flushed out helps everything. It helps us guide that to where if I'm not there, our team can rely on these documents, on these operational procedures to operate in the culture that we're building with them.
So I hear Ben saying a couple things. I translate what I just heard you say, Ben, as operationalizing the culture change process. I think sometimes we idealize or ideate, whatever word you want to use, our vision for change, and we stay in this abstract space, which oftentimes does not translate, especially to our operational leaders and to those who are investing in the change process. So one is, what is my role in the change process, not just as the visionary or facilitator of the change, but what I heard you say is you had to align and understand, well, my role has to shift. In this case, you had to level up. So now I'm requiring other people to level up, which means you needed the right systems, you needed the right processes to support the change process. So we get out of just ideation and into action, right? It's operationalizing the change. I think a lot of times they view us in our capacity as solely as these ideators and people scientists who don't really understand what's required to operate the business. So you connect it back to what is my role? It's almost like a racing model for the change process, right?
I think
So write that down.
for getting leaders on board and getting leaders rallied around either culture protection or culture change, simplicity, transparency, and repetitiveness. One of the beautiful things at Indeed is the mission statement is we help people get jobs. It's on all of I was going to say not all of their t-shirts. And it's the second slide in every presentation that any leader in the organization does. And that is important, and you're always going to your lowest common denominator, making sure that everybody is clear on what we're there to do every single day. Whether it is helping somebody get a job or changing culture or taking out a leader that isn't supporting the culture or isn't creating a culture on their team, because you end up with all these subcultures as well. There's this big universal umbrella of culture at a company, and then you've got, we were a global organization in 40 countries, so each one of those had their culture, and then each function had its culture, and each leader had its culture on the team, and you want them all in some way, shape, or form. It was somebody this morning, the presentation was the yarns of the blanket. I completely blank, and I remember nobody's name. Anthropologist. Yes. See, I know you're an anthropologist, I forgot your name, I apologize. But it is like all of that, and that's what gets you to this culture. And to affect change or to keep a culture the way it is, you've all got to be singing from the same songbook, you've all got to be rowing together in the same way, in the same direction. And I think that is so important. And I think sometimes we lose sight of, if I'm sitting in an executive meeting, I understand what's going on, but then I've got to go out and communicate to my lowest common denominator, so I've got to simplify it to the extent that I can. And it's not about dumbing it down, it's about meeting people where they are and helping them understand what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, and then kind of bringing them along for the journey.
I hear Paul saying a couple things. The whiffum matters. Why? What's in it for me? Another way to say it is why it fucking matters. All right? Meeting someone where they are means to translate that vision into a way that makes it practical and applicable for the individual, right? The lowest common denominator translates it and processes it different than the CEO. Another thing I heard you say, which has me thinking about this broader context of sometimes we compartmentalize ourselves in our efforts around driving change. I was even cringing at the premise of calling it a culture committee, because sometimes that language ostracizes us in an organization because we fail to connect with the decision makers or the individuals with whom we're trying to realize the change through. I don't care if you call it culture committee, steering committee, operational excellence committee. Call it what's necessary to meet the persons where they are to bring them forward. We're the strategists, we're the people scientists. Doesn't mean I need to teach you the science. I need to teach you the practice. Write that down.
Yeah, the practice and provide the tools, right? And it brings a thought about change readiness, assessing change readiness, right? And if you Google change readiness assessments, you're going to find a ton of them. And I was, in my previous role, I was, working on sort of developing a change readiness assessment. And I was so shocked at all of the things that came up that were very, very much focused on how ready is your organization to, transfer from Microsoft Outlook to Google, or to, a lot of sort of operationally focused. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all know that technology is important and we have to switch from one thing to the next, fine. But there is this idea of psychological change readiness. Where is your system psychologically and mentally when it comes to whatever change you are about to embark on, right? And so I started doing research, and I found that there are 3 components that are really important to pay attention to or to think about, and to eventually, try to collect information on around what might represent that psychological readiness, right? Does your system agree that the change is necessary? Do they think that it is actually doable? And do they find that you have the resources that are necessary to make that change happen, right? Whether that's financial, amount of people. We all know there's a lot of, changes and things that are started during, within organizations. And we're all like, well, we don't have staff for that. Like, we don't, everyone's really busy, So So those are three things to think about. And then there are ways to kind of evaluate through surveys and things of how your system is sort of showing up at that point. And that's what's going to then create, or at least, surface where the resistors are and where the pockets are, where you really need to address within your organization before you embark on the change process. And I think we know that, change processes are only about 30% successful. And of course, as human beings, nobody likes change, we don't like it. Then we don't think about the sustainability side, the implementation side, the fact that we have to keep working at what we've just gone through in order to, make it sustainable. But before even starting, think about evaluating where your organization is, as far as readiness of the people, because at the end of the day, it's the people who are doing the work for you. And we've all, everyone has really talked a lot about throughout the day about not just dumping plans on your organization, right? Like, you've got to include everyone, and especially those who are in the trenches, and get their thoughts, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but just wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of like psychological change readiness and how that can help you all as leaders to kind of evaluate before just starting on the process.
Awesome, thank you. So psychological change readiness, I hear you say. For me, I think in frameworks of 3. So I heard you say, is it required?
Yeah, it's an important. Yeah.
Is it reasonable? Mm-hmm. And do I have the resources? The 3 R's.
I've written that down.
Okay. I'll give you the mic so you can say it. All right, so I hear there's some individual work we need to do. I hear there's this organizational approach that we need to have in ensuring that we have the right people at the right table with the right sources doing the right things. I want to pivot a bit and talk about the barriers, right? Because all of this sounds great, but the reality is we're facing barriers every day in our capacity to actually do what we're talking about. So how do we start to really get after what those barriers are and do so in a way that we can apply it tomorrow? I want to do that both in the conversation by the panel, then I want to take it to you all. Because the reality is you all came in here with some barriers on your mind around how do I impart change within my organization. So I want to get from ideology to our applied sciences side of our brain. Right? So let's talk about some common barriers that you encounter both in your business practice today. I mean, just something that's really just prevalent that you need to get after and how you're approaching getting after it. I want you to do the same in your experiences as practitioners, but then we're going to take it to the audience. I know damn well we don't have 5 more minutes left. He held the sign up. Let's pivot. I'm going to share one thought around that. I want to go to this audience, and if we go over 5 or 10 minutes, forgive me, Angela. Please have me back. I'm sorry. Because I really want to take it to the audience. Because again, we want you to walk away with some practicality and how does it apply to the broader call for culture framework that we're talking about here, and that's moving and approaching our communication. Please share common challenge or barrier that we encounter as part of this change process. Then we're going to take it to the audience.
I'm not sure how many of you have had a week, a month, or even a year of just like, if everything wrong could happen, it tended to happen. We had a pretty nightmare scenario when it came to terminating a manager that we had tried to work and develop over a course of a year. When termination finally happened, it's like everything you could imagine that someone could try to retaliate, like it happened. And the thing that I want to leave people with is that I think it was really important during that time. It died down and everything ended up being fine because ultimately the team really trusted us, which was really, really humbling. But continuing to stay optimistic and be like, it'll get better tomorrow. I'm just gonna keep leaning in. I'm gonna keep staying connected. I'm gonna keep communicating. I'm going to dispel all these negative thoughts I have in my head that people are talking about me, talking about us, saying how bad of a job we're doing or how bad of a person I am, right? Like I'm gonna push into just believing in people, believing in myself, and I'm gonna try my best every single day. And then when I get through this, I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to therapy either way, but I'm going to work through those things. I'm going to work through those issues and those things that we're building up. But as a leader, I'm going to lean into believing the best in myself and believing the best in others, and then work through all those other things once the problem is solved.
So addressing our personal barriers that get in the way of our as a change agent in our process. How many of you, who, by a show of hands, who wants to share something that you walked in here with saying, if I don't walk out of here with the capacity to overcome this barrier for me in this change process, then I'm going to be disappointed. So, something that you have on top of your mind right now. Who has the courage to share what that is that they're facing right now? It's like I'm calling you to the altar or something. Y'all are like, ah. I'm going to come over to you. Just share your name again, because just in case we forgot.
My name is Cassandi. It's not that I'm facing it right now, because I am, full transparency, in transition looking for a job. Okay. But what I have faced in the past and what we've talked about at this table is, how do you talk to leadership that's not very open and receptive? Because I once was trying to tell like a DEI, just insights that I was seeing being on the front lines, being like more junior. And I could tell that the person I was talking to was not even open and receptive. So what do you do in those situations?
Anyone on the panel wants to share? Then I have a thought, but.
I think, can you get at them with data? Can you get at them with somebody else that they may already have existing relationship with? We were talking about that at my table too, is can I get to somebody who has an in with them? I think are the two things I'd think. I'd also just say to you transparently, if they're not going to listen, they're not going to listen, and go find somebody that will.
I think to Paul's point as well, sometimes we're so passionate about this thing that we believe to be important, and we approach them with that level of passion, especially when it in the context of DE&I or DE&IB. The challenge with that is we haven't moved with the intention around empathy. If I'm going to meet you where you are, that means I have to seek to understand where you are. Which means instead of me approaching you in the context of DE&I or whatever I think is to be important, what if I just approach you with the desire to seek to understand? Now, I'm unpacking as I'm engaging with you in dialogue where you may be relative to what I believe to be important, but let me just start with the conversation around, hey, so if you were to improve any aspect of how we operate as a business, in terms of like the demographic of our workforce, what would you change about it? Hey, you've been here so long. When you think about I'm sure you encountered so many different people over the last 30 years of your career. What makes someone really successful here and what makes someone fail here? Engaging in dialogue with this desire to understand gives us the tools we need to then appeal to what we believe to be their interests. Sometimes we try to go in, DE&I, culture, this and that. That may not be a part of that individual's connection to what's valuable or important to them. So they immediately, whoa, because there's sensitivity around that. I don't know how to have that conversation. Let me meet you where you are and then find a way to just create safety in the dialogue. I'll get you there. And a lot of times we go as this strategist and people scientists down this hole that people are like, I can't digest that. But maybe I can get after this other thing. Thank you for asking that question. Does that make sense? Who else wants to share? I know I'm way over time, so.
It's less about sharing, but more a question specifically for Paul and Cynthia. When we talk, my name is Jasmine Fluker, sorry. When we talk about cultural change in organizations, we're talking about it in a very shiny way right now. And what happens, I know what happens, but what happens when the answer is to coach somebody out? because a lot of my work is with nonprofits and educational organizations, and everybody feels ready. And then I roll out what the plan is, and they're like, what? Wait a minute. And I can prep them beforehand, and the tenets of white dominant culture is gonna tell them, like, I know what the reaction is going to be, but we haven't really talked about what happens when it's time to coach people out.
I think it's about honesty and respect, and having the difficult conversation. Like, as humans, we don't like difficult conversations. Like, we're programmed, hardwired not to have difficult and shy away from them. But we're doing each other and the organization a disservice by not having that. The other thing, I'm advising a nonprofit now, and one of the conversations I had recently was somebody who needs to be coached out, needs to not be in the organization more, is think of the impact they're having on everybody else in the organization. It's not just about them or their one direct report. It's about, you're a small organization, and this is, it's a cancer that's growing in your organization, and it's only going to continue to grow and get worse. And there are going to be more people that are on the precipice of, I'm not sure if I like it here or not, or I'm ready or I'm not ready, and they're going to join. And then it's going to become bigger an issue. And so if you don't deal with it, it's going to get worse more than likely. The other thing that I'll say, because I don't, as an former HR practitioner, I don't like firing people. The least sexy, fun part of the job. And the way I would always get my head wrapped around it, like the night before I had to have a conversation, is this is a business decision that I'm making. This is no adjudication on them as a human being. They may be a wonderful, amazing human being and part of culture and all of that. They're just not, this is not the right place for them right now. And it's a business decision. It has nothing to do personally. And that's how I would coach managers through that conversation, because you get hung up in I'm affecting somebody's life. I'm affecting somebody's livelihood. And I don't, in a negative way, and I don't want to do that. But I run a business that's more than just one person. And I think that's the way to think about it in the broader context.
Awesome. I'm way over time. 1 minute. Okay. All right. She gave me the rack up. I thought Sandman was going to come out with the cane and the... Yeah, I'm done.
You're getting a hook.
Any last words, something that's really pressing on your heart around what you want to leave here with that we can address from a panel perspective, because you got a lot of experience on the stage and in the room. Come on. You didn't come here for nothing.
Sorry, Paul, I had a question for you. With managing workforces across many different office spaces, what was the one aha of trying to get everybody on the same page from a culture standpoint? And where was that distinction between respecting the cultural nuances of different markets? Any insight there? Because I think there might be some folks in the room that might.
Yeah, and it's tough. There's no easy answer to this, but I think it's just what you said. It's here's what our culture is at Indeed. One of the things I did at Indeed for my 8 years there is employee focus groups. The best effing source of data, like better than any engagement survey. And you build relationships, and they start to tell you when things start to go wrong. They're more open to talking to you. And that's not always the case as an HR practitioner. People typically don't like to talk to us sometimes, depending on how you come across. But I think it is knowing where you're going and what your culture is overall, and then respecting the cultural nuances. We had 3 offices in Germany with 3 very different leaders in 3 different cities. And each one of those offices had a different feel and look, like we were physically set up to make them feel or make them look differently and respectful of the culture that we're in or the city that we're in, but also play to those leaders. And I think play those leaders like personas and insights. And I think that's about trusting your leaders and going back to transparency, repetitiveness, and simplicity. It's making sure they understand what you're trying to do and letting them decide somewhat how they're going to do it. And you can measure that by engagement, attrition, DIMB stats and things like that. And you can manage it broadly that way without making it so prescriptive.
Awesome. Give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all so much.